If you haven't heard yet, I just launched Future of Work Leaders, a global community of the world's top people leaders shaping the future of work and employee experience. If you are interested in learning more and requesting an invite, and if you are a chief human or chief people officer, then head on over to futureofworkleaders.com. Again, that is futureofworkleaders.com. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Future Ready Leadership. My guest today, David Deming, professor of political economy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. You'll probably also notice that I'm in a different background, different setup today. So I'm using my iPhone as my webcam. My wife is in our studio. But the good news is that you get to be the first one to see this. Look at that shirt. Future
Oh, wow.
Ready.
Future Ready.
Yeah. Yes.
On brand.
So there might be a Future Ready store coming soon. We're testing out some product ideas. We got a little hat over here. So maybe.
Wow, very nice.
Maybe in the future that'll come out. David's actually been a guest on the show. I think it was in 2017. So not quite a decade, but many, many years ago. And I reached out.
You haven't aged a day, Jacob.
Yeah, we still look the same. I think I didn't have a son when we first interviewed. I think my daughter was probably just turning 1. And I was living in the Bay Area. Now I live in Los Angeles and I have 2 kids. So a lot of
All right, yeah. My 2 kids are teenagers now, so.
Oh my goodness.
That comes at you fast.
Podcast.
Yeah.
But I asked David to be a guest on the show today because I came across an article that came out fairly recently, and we'll go into more details of the article, but I just want to read a quote from the article, which is, "We found that people with the greatest preference for being in charge are on average worse than randomly assigned managers." So I'm just going to let everybody think about that quote. We're going to unpack a lot. We're going to get into the study and explore that in more detail. But David, thank you for joining me again today.
It's great to be with you again, Jacob.
So let's start with the background of that study because I came across it. I know it got shared a lot on social media. There was a lot of discussion around it. So before we get to the findings, what was the study? What did you do? And then we'll talk about what you actually found.
Yeah, sure. So we were interested in the question of what makes somebody a good manager and how to identify good managers. And our starting point for that was, I guess, the observation that when you think about how many firms pick managers, they often do it in ways that are not literally random in the sense of throwing darts at a board or rolling dice, but can be haphazard, right? It's some combination of who do I think is good at the job that they're doing before. So who's a good, line worker, production worker, or who's a good, software developer, or whatever it is in the firm, who seems like they're smart and talented in general. And then also, who wants it, who wants the job, who seems like they want to be in charge. And so we designed an experiment in a lab at the University of Essex in the United Kingdom, where we put people in groups. And we did it a particular way, Jacob, that was important for the study. We randomly assigned people to groups. And in particular, we assigned them to multiple groups. So like the challenge of identifying who's good on a team or who's a good manager is that if I put David and Jacob and Frank on a team together and they do really well, who was responsible? Mm-hmm. You don't know because there's 3 people and there's only one outcome, which is how well the team did. And moreover, is it because each of them is good individually or because they get along really well, they have great chemistry or bad chemistry in the opposite case or whatever? And so in order to untangle that knot, what you need to do is you need to assign people repeatedly to different teams. So I'm going to put Jacob on a team with David and Frank, and then with, Betsy and Horace, and then with Eunice and Maud, and on and on and on. And if every time we add Jacob to the team, he makes the team better, regardless of who his teammates are, then we say Jacob's good in a team. So that's the kind of, and there's a lot of, fancy methodology behind that, but that's the basic idea. If any of your listeners are basketball fans, there's something called plus minus, which calculates what is the point differential between your team and the other team when you're on the court, which is different than the final score. And so there are some players in the NBA who have very high plus minuses. And that means they're kind of doing the little things that help a team get together. So it's kind of like that idea if you were to randomly assign people to lineups. So we did that, and then we added another wrinkle. Yeah. Several hundred. I don't remember the exact number, 400 or 500 people.
Okay, so it's a big group.
Yeah, it's a pretty big group and around multiple teams. And the experiment happened in many different sessions over the course of a month. So it was pretty big. And we did another thing, which is we said, okay, well, the groups, we structure the task that they have to do so that there's a leader and there's 2 team members. And the leader's job is to coordinate the other team members and to kind of submit the final assignment and decide who's going to do what. Okay. And in one condition, we picked the leader randomly. And in another condition, we asked people, well, how much do you want to be a leader? Do you really want to be in charge, or do you only kind of want to be in charge? And they had to rank it on a scale of 1 to 10. And in the second condition, we said, okay, the people with the highest scores, the highest preference for leadership, they get to be the leader. And that's the source of the finding you cited at the beginning. When we pick people through that method, which is like who raises their hand, who really wants to be leader, those leaders are on average worse than when we randomly pick the leaders.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, so many different implications for that because, to your point, the summary from that. And by the way, before we get into that, let me just ask, what was the task that they had to do?
Yeah, it's something we designed called the collaborative production task. It's just to keep it brief. You can read the paper if you want to know the details. We asked the team to do 3 different things, and then the output from each of those things, and they're kind of like problem solving tasks or games. The output from each of those was combined to form some final output that they were paid for. So the teams did. When they did better, they were paid more, so they had an
Okay.
incentive to do well, and they got the score that was the minimum of the 3 tasks. Okay, so it's kind of like the weakest link in the chain. So the leader's job was to say, okay, how do I assign people so that we get the best score?
Yeah.
It wasn't, and you couldn't do it where like, okay, I'm really good, I'm just going to do everything and dominate the other two team members. No, you actually have to work together because everybody has to do one thing, and you have to figure out like who's the least bad.
Okay.
So and this is a technique that's been used in many other studies as a way to encourage collaboration and a way to kind of force teamwork through the design of the experiment. And we did find that managers, the primary way that managers varied in their ability was some of them were pretty good at figuring out who should be assigned to which tasks to make the team do best collectively, and some of them weren't that good at it.
I mean, the finding is very interesting. I think there's a lot of implications, right? Because essentially, again, to read the quote again, people with the greatest preference for being in charge made the worst leaders as opposed to people who didn't show preference in charge. They were randomly assigned, made better leaders. And so I guess the very first question is, in an organizational perspective, we always hear you should show initiative, you should raise your hand, you should take on the roles that other people don't want. If there's a leadership position, you should want to, raise your hand
Yeah.
and speak up for it. I've interviewed several CEOs on this podcast and books worked with where they've shared that the only reason they got into those roles is because they raised their hand and they said, I'm willing to go for it. I'm willing to
Yeah.
try it. So does the findings from this paper go against that? Should we not be promoting people who are raising their hand and saying, I want a chance?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say it doesn't. It goes against promoting people purely based on who wants the job the most. Now, some of the anecdotes you mentioned briefly, people say, well, you're not going to get the job. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, or
Exactly.
the worst they can say is no, or all these cliches that basically mean you have to shoot your shot. That's still true. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be a leader. It just turns out that wanting to be a leader isn't a very good predictor of whether you're good at it.
Oh,
And so it's incumbent on organizations to say, okay, it's great that you want to be a leader, but I need to have some systematic way of figuring out who's actually going to be good at it, rather than just relying on the intensity of your preference. And the reverse is also true, Jacob. So there's some people who actually don't are content to fade into the background. Maybe they're introverts. Maybe they don't take on leadership roles, but when you put them in charge, they actually do pretty well. And so that's an important thing for organizations to keep in mind too. That it might be the quiet people, it might be the people who you least expect could end up being good managers. And so it's worth being a bit systematic about how you pick
yeah.
people for promotion.
So how do you do that? Because obviously it's very hard to consider somebody for a promotion if they don't volunteer and say that they want it.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, usually inside of an organization, that's typically what happens is you do your annual performance reviews, you talk about your career plan, your career path, and the employee says, yeah, I'm interested in leadership. The leader says, okay, let's put you on some sort of a path to get there. But if
Yeah.
you're an employee or you're working with employees who aren't actually raising their hand and saying, yeah, I'm interested in that, how are you as a leader possibly supposed to know to even give those people a chance if they're not
Yeah.
raising their hand and asking for it?
It's a really great question. And I think, in fairness, like I want an academic study to be as general as possible, but this is a case where it really depends on the organizational context. I think a general rule that's helpful, Jacob, at least in my experience, is whatever you're trying to hire for or promote for,
Hmm.
you need to design an assessment of the people that you're considering to be as closely aligned with the thing you want them to do as possible.
Yeah.
Right? So raising your hand and saying, I want the job is not very related to doing the job. We all know that actually being like managing people is kind of grunt work. It's not flashy. It's not glamorous. It's not. Raising your hand and saying yes, me, pick me is the easy part. The hard part is just putting one foot in front of the other every day and getting it done and doing performance reviews and having
Yeah.
difficult conversations and all these things that we have to do in leadership roles. And so I think you just want to give people a chance to actually experience the job, maybe in short rotations, maybe in simulations. It depends on it depends on the organizational context, what's easiest for you. But you want to say, okay, what is the thing I want them to do? And then let me give them some practice doing it. And then let me design a way to assess how well they did in that practice.
And some people
And I
even
think
say,
it's just a lot of slippage
yeah.
in
And some
between
people even
that
say
and what people
no.
actually do.
Because I
Yeah.
remember my dad, he retired, but I remember before he retired, he would tell me stories of and he was in aerospace as an engineer, and there'd be several times where his employers over the years would come to him and say, "Hey, you're doing a great job. We'd love to promote you to the point, where you're managing other people." And my dad would be like, "I'm good." I said,
Yeah.
"It's not worth, right? It is a salary bump, but the bump isn't big enough to warrant the extra responsibility and the extra hours and the extra
Yep.
work that you need to do as a leader of people, as opposed to being an individual contributor." And I hear the stories from a lot of people where they get offered these promotions and they're like, "I'm good. I'm good where I'm at. I don't need it."
That's another important reason to give people practice, because there may be some people who are good at it but don't enjoy it.
Yeah.
you know um and that's part of it too. Like, it is some, you have to have some, I mean, the preferences are, I think, in some ways related to whether you think you'll enjoy it. Maybe some of the people who said they didn't want to do it because they thought they'd be bad, but they also might think they're fine at it, they just hate it, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But again, it just goes to the point that we should think about management as a career, as a
Mhm.
skill set that not everybody has. And actually, one of the things we found was that being good at the task itself was related to being a good manager, but
Hmm.
not that highly. So there's a lot of people off the diagonal, people who are good, producers, line workers, talent, but aren't good managers, and then people who are good managers who aren't especially, standouts
Yeah.
in terms of performance on the job.
And I think
So
one
it's
of the
just,
things, oh, sorry,
yeah.
go ahead.
No, it just goes again to the point that design and assess for the thing that you actually want, which is management, which is a quite distinct thing that not
Yeah.
everyone's good at.
I think one of the things that you found in your in the study was that this happens because of overconfidence. And
Yep.
so, why is overconfidence a bad thing? Because we keep hearing about the importance and the need of being confident, and the importance
Yeah.
of speaking up, showing initiative. But your finding shows that if you're overconfident, then that's where we start to see the issues. Is
Yeah.
overconfidence the same thing as ego?
No, so I mean, it's kind of in the it's kind of definitional with the word. Like, confidence is good, overconfidence is bad.
Yeah.
Right. And the way we measure overconfidence is we ask people, so we have some questions um, about, we ask people, are you good at reading people? Do you have good political skills? There's a couple of surveys that are get at, like, are you the kind of person who picks up on other people's social cues? Are you the kind of person who knows what people mean when they say things? That kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
we ask people that thing. And then we also give them a test that's called the reading the mind and the eyes test, which is a widely used measure of emotional perceptiveness. You basically show people a bunch of just slits of the eyes, and then you have to correctly identify the emotion that the eyes or the face are expressing.
Interesting.
And
I wonder how
some
I would do
people,
on that test.
well, you can take it on our website, skillslab.dev. You can go take it right now and see how you do.
Interesting.
But when we say overconfident, what we meant was there are some people who in the first category of questions, yes, I'm great at reading people. Yes, I've got great political skills. They're like, yes, I'm good at that. But then when they take the test, they're not as good at it. They're actually more average or even below average. And that's what we mean by overconfidence. So it's
Oh,
kind of like a data-driven measure of overconfidence. Again, like, if you're really good at reading people, it's fine to say you are. That's just appropriate confidence. It's
yeah.
overconfidence that hurts you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. So,
And so, just to go, like, kind of drill down on that, why would that be bad for managers?
yes.
Well, one thing that makes a bad manager is if they think that they're correctly reading their employees, but they're actually misreading them. So, I might think, okay, Jacob's here working for me and he did a subpar job on this thing, and I'm telling him that. And as we're talking, he's getting upset and he's tuning me out, and I'm not picking up on those emotional cues. And I'm just, berating him. Okay. Or it could be the opposite. Like, Jacob is the kind of person who needs some tough love, and he's tuning me out when I'm talking to him, and I'm not noticing that. And so emotional perceptiveness, I think, is very plausibly related to
Oh,
managerial success. You have to understand where your employees are, how to motivate them, what's going on in their heads.
Yeah, which is huge because I also think this is a relatively new skill that doesn't get talked about enough because a lot of
Yeah.
manager, we always think about delegation, we think of command and control, we think of making strategic decisions. But part of it, I think a lot of really great leaders also really know how to read the room. And
Yep.
so you can almost look at somebody, not even talk to them and just kind of tell, okay, that person is in a tough spot. That person's upset. Wow, that person is like glowing when they're walking. They're just beaming. So being able to pay attention to that, I think, is really important. Is that something that you can teach or train? Is to pay attention to body language and emotional intelligence and perceptiveness,
Yeah.
and or is it more kind of like you have it or you don't?
Yeah, so I think it's probably a bit of both, like most things. People differ quite a bit in their baseline ability to do this, but it can be taught and it can be improved upon. When we talked 7 years ago, we talked about my work on social skills and teamwork, and this was kind of, in many ways, this paper that I've written recently is derived from that idea that the ability to understand others is actually a skill. It's not like, making good cocktail party conversation or small talk. It's actually like, do I have the emotional perceptiveness to be able to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes? Psychologists call this theory of mind.
Yep.
Can I think like Jacob when I need to, in order to motivate him appropriately, or to talk with him or meet him where he's at emotionally, or whatever it is. And that's an especially important skill for managers in knowledge intensive work, like in white collar work, in complex organizations. Why? Because when I tell you you're an employee and I say I need you to do X, I'm not giving you a script that says in order to do X, do A, then B, then C, then D, all the way down to X. I'm not giving you that script. I'm asking you to figure it out. I'm asking you to solve the problem. And
Yeah.
that means you have to be motivated. And a lot of the work is work that you're not going to show me everything you've done. You're just going to come to me with the final output. And so I need, you need, I need as a manager to make you feel like you're valued, and to make you feel motivated to do the work, even if it's unseen, even if you may not get credit for everything, even if I don't actually even know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so important for managers and leaders to have good social skills or good managerial skills and have emotional perceptiveness, because much of the work is happening outside of your site and outside of your direct control. And so you need your employees to be aligned with your mission and the mission of the organization to succeed.
Yeah, and I honestly don't think a lot of these leaders have that theory of mind because we see this a lot, especially when it comes to technology, right? I mean, how many times have
Yeah.
you talked to a leader or even to a friend or a family member and they have the phone, right? I've been at so many dinners or lunches or breakfasts with friends, with good friends who in the middle of the conversation, they pull out their phone and they start doing something and they get so
Yeah.
sucked into whatever it is on their screen that they literally forget that there are other human beings around them. And I
My number one recommendation for people who are trying to build these skills is to have teenage daughters. Nothing makes you flex the muscle of emotional perceptiveness like living in a household with
oh
teenage
yeah, I have
girls.
an 8-year-old
So
daughter, and
that's been my daily practice.
yeah, I'm so vigilant just about screens and technology, even with my 8-year-old daughter, because I don't want that to happen. Because to your point, I mean, even a lot of studies have been coming out around Gen Z specifically that they lack confidence, they lack emotional acuity, they're not able to do these things, and some of it is as a result of a culture of safetyism that was created for them when they were younger. Some of it as a result of the pandemic, where they were stuck and locked behind. They were in their homes. They could only be looking at screens, so they didn't develop a lot of these
Yep.
emotional skills and capabilities. And as a result, there are articles. I think there was one that came out in the Wall Street Journal yesterday or today that even talked about how Gen Z is going to become the dominant generation at work, and it's causing a lot of problems for managers because this generation does not have the social skills, they don't have the resiliency, the adaptability, and they're just not prepared to be members of a company. And it's a
Yeah.
weird and crazy thing, like making eye contact, just having the knowing that you're around people and put your phone away. It's crazy that you even have to tell an adult these things, but we live and work in a society where you have to be like, hey, can you put away your phone? Is that okay? Even in meetings now, I do workshops sometimes for executives, and one of the big complaints that they share is, oh yeah, in previous workshops, everybody's just like on their email or on their phone, and they don't even pay attention to what's going on in the workshop. And these are grown, like 50, 60-year-old men and women who are just sucked
Yeah.
into whatever's on their screens. Very bizarre.
Well, so I do think, yeah, so I do think, there's the genre of, kids these days can't hack it in the workplace is an old one. And I do think there's probably something to it. On the other hand, I think it's incumbent upon organizations to understand. And if I look back to when I was in my early 20s, like I didn't have maybe this is the answer to your question, can these skills be developed? I think they clearly can because I feel that I have developed them personally. I think many other people do. Again, not because we get older and wiser, but with practice. So
Hmm.
when you're in school, there's not actually a lot of teamwork that's required. Everything's individualized. In the classroom, it's very
Yeah.
clear what the objective is. And the workplace is much fuzzier. It requires much more teamwork, much more long-term projects, understanding of others, understanding where you fit in. And so I think it's learning by doing. Like if you put people in those situations and they respond and they get feedback and they practice, they're going to get better at it. And so I think that's really the challenge for organizations today
Hmm.
is to accept that when you get some young people, it's not that they are incapable because of their phone, they just don't have a lot of practice.
Yeah.
And so, you know, give them some and understand that they'll improve. And then let me tell you one, proud father story on that. So my daughter began 10th grade. She's her first day of school yesterday. And she said
Wow.
to me, um, you know, Dad, I've been thinking that, I get afraid to talk to other people or talk to friends or strangers or people I don't know. And so then I stay quiet. But I was thinking that actually I should talk to them because it'll be good for me to get practice. But also, when I think about it, I bet they're just as afraid as me. And so if I just go talk to them, they'll be happy that I did that and they'll respond well. So she was actually going through the work of putting herself in the mind of the other person. Like, don't just think about your own fear. Think
Yeah.
about that the other person probably finds this awkward too and will appreciate you, breaking the silence.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, and that's a I was so happy to hear her say that, and she'd probably be embarrassed if she hears me talk about it this way. But I think that's growing up, that's maturing, that's building skills by understanding that it's not just about you, it's about the person in front of you and putting yourself in their shoes mentally.
Are you a chief people officer or a chief human resource officer that is responsible for the future of work and employee experience? If so, then you're going to want to check out futureofworkleaders.com. It's a new global community that I am putting together of the world's top people leaders from brands including Neiman Marcus, Johnson & Johnson, Dow, Lego, Tractor Supply, Northrop Grumman, and dozens of others. If you're interested in learning more and requesting an invite, and again, if you are a chief human or chief people officer, then head on over to futureofworkleaders.com. So you mentioned that there are two specific skills or two specific criteria that really help identify who are going to be the successful managers, who are going to be the successful leaders. And I thought we could dive into them. And then in the Leaders Toolkit section, towards the end of the show, we'll talk about how to develop these two or what actions people can take. The first one is something called IQ Raven's Progressive Matrices Test, which measures general and fluid intelligence, spatial reasoning, problem solving, etc. And the second one is economic decision making or the ability to allocate resources effectively. So I thought let's
Yeah.
start off with the first one, the IQ portion. I'm really
Yeah.
interested in this because, especially today, we keep hearing about EQ more important than IQ. And, you don't need IQ anymore. You really only need EQ. So, this finding of yours seems to go against that. And I was also really curious that none of the two predictors of success were related to EQ, even
Yeah.
though for the most of this conversation, we've been talking about kind of those human skills. So maybe let's start with why isn't EQ a part of these two criteria? And then let's dive into what is this IQ Ravens progressive matrices test?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of those occasions where you have to accept the finding, even if it's surprising. If you had asked me to predict what would have been important, I would have said, yes, EQ probably is going to show up. It might even show up more than IQ. In some past work I've done on teamwork, team production, I've found that. We didn't find that here. And I could speculate, in
Hmm.
an ad hoc way about why. I think part of it is the nature of the kind of by necessity, the artificial nature of the task. It's sort of a one-shot thing. These people don't know each other, and when they leave, they're not going to necessarily encounter each other. Although a few of them knew each other because of the nature of the subject pool. But maybe it's the case that it's kind of this one-shot thing, whereas EQ matters more for repeated interactions, building trust. You know, jobs where the division of responsibility is less obvious, that are more complex. That wouldn't surprise me if we designed something that was more realistic and
Okay.
longer run. maybe they would balance. But IQ is related to everything. People always ask like, well, everything's about IQ. Well, I would say, look, what is IQ? Okay, do you know what IQ is? IQ is just the common statistical factor across a number of tests. So if you take 8 different tests and then I analyze the tests and I say, what is the common factor of performance across all those? How is Jacob's performance correlated across all the tests? It turns out that people who are good at test A are usually good at test B and test C and test D. And so that's G. That's what G means in the psychological literature. It doesn't have any kind of magical meaning. It's just hey, people who are good at some tests are good at other tests. That's it. And so that's not that surprising because we're asking people to do things that look a lot like tests, and it turns out that having a high IQ makes you good at everything, and that's kind of a known thing.
Yeah.
So that's my interpretation of that. I don't think it's that unique to management. I think it's just kind of everything.
Okay. So IQ is still important. Good to
Yeah,
know.
yeah, exactly. And then the
Um,
second one was more interesting. Okay, first of all, because that one was a little bit more correlated with performance than IQ.
okay.
Um, and it's a measure that my co-authors and I developed in a different paper about management, about decision making, I should say. And what we did was ask people to assign workers to jobs. So basically, the idea is, each worker is good at some tasks and not as good at others. So
Okay.
we actually show people this. So it's like, Jacob's pretty good at writing copy. He's decent at data analysis, and he's terrible at expense reports or something. Okay, and then we have a same kind of what we call a productivity schedule for every other person. So there's Jacob and there's David and there's everybody else, and everybody has their, and some people are good at some things and not others. And the task we give people is, can you figure out the best assignment? And if you'll
Hmm.
remember back to the description of the experiment, it's almost exactly like that. So it's like, can you figure out who should do what job? Which of course is very related to management. You got a bunch of workers and you got to figure out who's going to do what. And so it turns out that that test that we designed to measure that skill is highly related to being a good manager in the lab experiment.
Hmm. I remember I went on maybe you can mention the website again, the Skills Lab?
Yeah, skillslab.dev, skillslab.dev.
Skillslab.tv. Yeah, I remember that's one of the games that's on there, right? So I remember.
Yep, that's right. You can play it. It's called the assignment game.
Okay. Yeah, I remember seeing that on there. So,
And I should just say, Jacob, and that we have a separate paper about that. What we find is we give that we give that test to a bunch of people, both in the U.S. and Denmark, and find that it strongly predicts people's labor income, even after accounting for their IQ. And it's more predictive in jobs where you have to make more decisions, like managerial jobs versus, let's say, sales jobs or something like that.
okay. So these two, so IQ and economic decision making, these were the two factors that most predicted effective leadership in this experiment that you did.
Yep.
Uh, how how high were these predictors, right? Because it could be, it's 2%. It's like, were these substantial high predictors, and were there other variables and attributes that you looked at besides these two? Like, basically, I'm trying to understand how important are
How
these two
big were the
really?
impacts? Yeah. Yeah, so they're pretty big. So just to take economic decision-making skills as an example, we did this simulation in the paper. We said, what if instead of picking managers randomly or picking them based on, who wants to be a manager, we pick them by people who have the highest score on these tests?
Okay.
How much different would average performance of teams be? And it turns out it would be about zero point 0.7 standard deviations, which, what does that mean? Well, it means you would move from about the 50th percentile to something like the 63rd percentile. So that's pretty big. That's like, if you went back and you took a test, you'd said, like, hey, if I go study, I can move from being average to being 63rd percentile, or better than about 2/3 of people. That's a pretty big impact. And so that's around the size of the impact that we found. Again, not like you're automatically the best, but it's a substantial improvement in a competitive economy. A firm that were to use some technique like this to get a 10 percentile point improvement in managerial performance would have a big leg up on their competitors.
Okay. Uh, was there any difference in terms of men, women, difference in terms of age?
Not really. We found very small and not statistically different from zero um, correlations between demographic characteristics and managerial performance.
Interesting. Wow, that's crazy.
Yep.
So similar for men and women. That's yeah, that's fascinating.
Yep.
Um,
Now it turns out men are much more likely to say they want to be leaders. Okay, so
okay,
men are much more
okay,
likely to say they want to be in charge, but they're not really better at it. They're not
okay.
worse. They're not better either.
But they're more likely to say that they want to get into those leadership roles.
Yeah. So in the self-selection arm, the arm where we pick people based on who wants to be a leader, we had a lot more men than women.
Oh,
Whereas in the random arm, it was equal by construction.
huh. Very interesting. Okay. So let's talk about maybe what some of this means for organizations, and then we'll talk about how individuals or maybe how organizations can train for these two things specifically. But I guess from a leadership perspective, what do the findings mean for a typical organization or a typical team out there?
Yeah, so I think the biggest high level finding for organizations is that good management really matters, and there is a way to measure who's a good manager, and it's not necessarily the people you think.
Okay.
So taking seriously a systematic assessment system, um, and designing a measure of managerial performance that is related to the actual thing you want people to do, and then comparing people on it would unlock large productivity gains for organizations. So take the selection of managers seriously and be systematic about it.
Okay. Did you do anything to try to
And again, that goes.
understand?
I mean, I know that firms, and I just want to say, I know that most companies don't just pick the people who want to be managers the most.
Yeah.
They are more systematic than that. So that's a bit of a straw man in that sense. But I also don't think that most companies put people, randomly assign people to teams and develop this methodology we did to figure out who's good at managing a team.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of a hard thing to do. And I know they don't do it because the reason we did this lab experiment, I spent the better part of a year or two trying to convince companies to do this with their new employees. Like, don't you want to figure out who's a good manager? Let us randomly assign people to teams. But for whatever reason, I don't know why, companies didn't want to let us poke around and randomly assign people. But what we showed is that they should. They should let us do it because we could help them be better.
That's interesting. So you tried to actually get companies to do it and they just said no?
Nobody ever says no, Jacob. They just never say yes, and they drag their heels, and then eventually give up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
People are polite and nice. People aren't never say just no. They just, oh, we'll talk and I'll ask, and maybe this isn't the right time, and let's look at next quarter. We got a lot of things going on, and eventually you just say, okay, this isn't happening. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Totally get it. um, I forgot what I was going to ask you now. What were you just mentioning before we talked about that?
we were talking about economic decision making skill, maybe.
I can't remember. I had a. I'm sure it'll probably pop back into my mind a little bit later. But we were talking about implications for organizations, and you were saying, there are people that you should be hiring for these roles that maybe you're not aware of,
Yeah,
which I think is
that's right.
interesting. Any other implications for teams or organizations out there? So if I'm running a team, I'm inside of an organization, I'm trying to create a leadership development pipeline. Does this change or influence in any way the way that I'm going to be approaching that?
Yeah, one other point that I think I made in passing, but is worth emphasizing. So there's a very famous management rule called the Peter Principle. I'm
Okay.
sure your listeners may have heard of it. It's that people get promoted to the level of their incompetence. Right. So it's like basically, but that's the pithy way to say it. What really happens is if you promote people based on who's good at their current job. So if you've got a bunch of, let's say, software developers and you decide who's going to be a team leader based on who's the best developer, what we show in our study is that's definitely better than picking randomly, but it's worse than picking based on some management skill. So,
Hmm.
people who are good at the task itself that they're doing are on average better than random, but they're still not as good as you could get if you took management seriously as a skill. So that's the other important thing for organizations is don't just pick the best workers. Try to find people who are going to be good managers, even if they're not necessarily the best workers.
But the criteria is going to be different for each company depending on what they care about and what they value and what
Totally.
makes a successful leader in there. So you can't just say, for example, for every company out there, look at these five criteria. It's going to be different for every organization.
Exactly. That's why I tried to say the principle that I think operates here, which is, you know, put people in situations that are as closely aligned with what you actually want them to do as possible
Yeah.
and measure them and assess them in those situations.
Hmm.
So can I tell you one quick story that I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
illustrates this
Stories are
point?
great.
So probably 10, 15 years ago, there was a big effort in education to try to measure effective teaching. And this is super important because teaching is the biggest occupation in the country. And lots of studies have shown better teachers improve kids' test scores, which translate to more educational attainment, greater earnings, et cetera. So if you
And you
found
just
some
reminded
way.
me what I wanted to ask you, so I'm going to write it down here. So
Okay, good. Yeah. So if you found some way to figure out who were the best teachers when you hired them, that would be hugely important for the economy, for education, for everything. And so the Gates Foundation and a number of other foundations invested literally billions of dollars into what they call the Measures of Effective Teaching project, which is if we had a million things we could measure about teachers, who's going to be a good teacher? And
okay.
what that work basically found was that nothing predicts who's going to be a good teacher. Nothing on a resume predicts it. I mean, there's a very small correlation with IQ or SAT scores or subject mastery, but it's men aren't better teachers than women or vice versa. Any kind of demographic, what preparation program you went into, like what the selectivity of the college you went to. None of those things are good
Mm.
predictors of being a good teacher at all. The only thing that predicts being a good teacher is if I ask you to either teach 1 year. Teachers who are good in their first year are good the rest of their lives because it's very predictive. Or there are some studies that show if I ask you to give a sample lesson and I grade it on a systematic rubric, that's related to who's a good teacher. So it's like if you want to know who's going to be a good teacher, have them teach and assess them teaching. It's
Yeah.
kind of common sense. And it's the same thing with managers. Have them manage
Hmm.
it and then see how they do. So that's the lesson.
I wonder if that's an acceptable, like, hey, you might be a manager. We're going to trial you out and see if you're good for that role before you actually get promoted. How many people would be open to doing something like that?
Or like you could do a version of what we did, which is some kind of simulation,
Yeah.
like fake management. Yeah.
Although I did recently work for an organization where they told me that they have that kind of an approach where somebody who's in an individual contributor role, they could volunteer to do this kind of stretch assignment where they're in a leadership role for maybe 3 months just to kind of see how they like it and
Yep.
then evaluate. So I guess you could do something
That
like that.
sounds like exactly the right approach.
Yeah, yeah, that seems like it could be possible. So the question that I was going to ask you about that I remembered is in terms of ROI, because you mentioned productivity earlier.
Yeah.
So is there any correlation between hiring a manager that has these two specific attributes and how that might impact productivity, engagement, performance, ROI in terms of any criteria out there?
Yeah, so I mean, our study, it made a big difference in terms of performance. So like score on the task, ability, how well you did, how much you got paid. So the managers, got paid more in our study who were better, and it turns out that selecting based on some measure of managerial skill that we
Okay.
created, picks better people. So that for sure. Now, how that translates to the real world, I think there's a lot of evidence um, that certain management practices that are related to this. So, like Nick Bloom and colleagues, Rafael Sadun at the Harvard Business School and others have done a lot of work on what happens when organizations import systematic scientific management practices and how that increases their productivity. And it's
Okay.
kind of like measure, track, hold people accountable. It's like the kinds of things I'm talking about.
Okay.
And they've done a lot of work on how, let's say, like the when multinational companies when they move into other places outcompete other companies because they have this principles of scientific management approach. When companies get acquired by people who adopt these principles, they become more productive. So there's a ton of evidence out there on practices that are correlated with productivity. And what we're doing is saying, well, actually, those practices can be embodied more or less in certain people. So, like, some people are good at it and some are not.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. It's funny. This relates a little bit, sort of tangentially to a poll that I actually did on LinkedIn fairly recently. And it was around, are you familiar with the concept of MEI versus DEI?
No.
So DEI, I'm sure you're familiar with, right? Diversity, equity,
Yep.
inclusion. And so MEI is emerging as sort of the counter to that, which is merit, excellence, and intelligence. And so this came about because there was a CEO of a AI company who basically said, I don't care about hiring people for DEI. Like, that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how good you are. Interested in how intelligent you are. And are you good? Right. And he was alluding to this idea of like IQ and things of that nature. So I actually did a poll on LinkedIn and because I was really curious what everybody thought about this. And I was asking everybody which company would you rather work for? Or what company do you think is going to perform better? A company that invests heavily in DEI or a company that invests heavily in MEI? And interestingly enough, the MEI won over the DEI. So a lot of people said that they would rather be part of an organization that made an emphasis and focused on MEI as opposed to DEI.
Yeah.
And I say it's tangentially related because it kind of goes back to this idea of competence, of IQ, which I think is making a little bit of a resurgence for 2024, 2025. I think during the pandemic, we were very focused on a lot of the well-being, the emotional stuff, the EQ stuff. And now post-pandemic, a lot of organizations are saying we need to get back to competence, to being good at your job, to focusing on IQ, to doing the things that, you know, move the needle at the end of the day. So it kind of made me think of that poll. I don't know if that relates at all to some of the stuff that you've been doing or thinking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's interesting because in some contexts there is no trade-off. I
Yeah.
think um,
56 to 44. Here it was. I said, which
I see.
company would you rather work for? The one that focuses on DEI or MEI? And
Yeah.
56% said MEI and 44% said DEI.
So, just within the context of our study, one way to think about how that plays out is if we picked managers based only on who wants to be manager, we'd end up with a lot of men. But as I said already, again, not that the men are worse on average, it's just that when you pick people based on who wants to be manager, you're going to be picking from further down in the distribution because there's going to be some people who really want to do it and aren't that good at it, but get it anyway because they
Yeah.
want it. And so you would end up with a workplace that is less diverse and also less effective. So in that context, not only is there no trade-off, actually picking people based on scientific criteria, like who's good at this job, who can actually do it, would give you a more balanced gender distribution and a higher average performance. Now, that's not always true.
Yeah.
I think, I think nobody's really like when you present it as a choice, people will make it. But I think very few people are really against diversity.
Actually having to make that choice. Yeah.
Yeah, they just see it as well. You're sacrificing too much excellence for that,
Yeah. These are
and
my
sometimes
unscientific LinkedIn polls to force people into a binary of like, do you want
well,
diversity or
no, I
do you
mean, it's
want
interesting
intelligence?
because what I take from it is what you're really asking people is how do they think these terms are coded these days? So it's like
Yeah.
it's not that the people who answered that they'd rather work in an MEI organization hate diversity necessarily. Some of them might, but it's probably not that. It's that they think organizations that make a statement that their priority is DEI have other characteristics that they may not enjoy. So that's the sense in which the zeitgeist has changed around this. I don't think it's
Mm.
really that people care more or less about diversity and merit. I think it's like what these terms, the kind of social coding of these terms has changed.
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's a whole podcast of like what these mean in the future. I've done a few of those too, so that's a whole separate bag of worms.
yeah,
Let's spend the last few minutes talking about how to actually develop these things. So we can look at this from two different perspectives. One, I'm an employee inside of an organization, and I'm listening to this and thinking, okay, well, I need to develop my EQ and I need to develop my economic decision making abilities. All right, everybody, my episode with David Deming continues for premium subscribers on Apple Podcasts only, and you have to subscribe to Future Ready Leadership Plus. Again, only on Apple. If you subscribe to this bonus episode, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into these two specific elements that he said are so crucial and are criteria of success for leaders, which are, again, the IQ Ravens progressive matrices test and economic decision-making abilities. So we're going to look at this from the perspective of the employee, what you should do as an employee to develop these things, and also from the perspective as a leader. So if I'm a leader, I'm looking to put together a team, I want to have employees who have these skills. What should I be looking for to tell if employees have those two things and how to start that conversation about promotion? So I hope you decide to subscribe and take advantage of that. If you do, you're going to get a bonus episode every week, as well as ad-free listening. I hate ads. I'm sure you hate ads too, but ads are important because they help the show running. It'll allow the sponsors to come in and to cover all the costs. So if you don't want any ads, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It's $4.99 a month, or you can subscribe for the year and get even a bigger discount on that. So thank you so much for tuning in, for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. And if you want the newsletter, go to thefutureorganization.com/newsletter and stay tuned. I'll be making some more announcements with these cool things like hats, shirts, all sorts of fun stuff. I'm still testing them out to see how they look, how the clothes feel, but you'll see more of that in coming episodes. So thank you so much. I will see you very soon.